Hi Rob, how are you?
Hello Gorjan, good to see you. So Gorjan, you're a very well-known figure in the seafood industry. What exactly do you do for those who don't know?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Well, this is my 20th year in this role. And so in 2005 I started basically as the first person to really cover this industry full-time for Rabobank. We have a department of 150 people now, of which 60 people are macroeconomists and 90 people are food and agri research analysts. And at that time, aquaculture and fisheries was becoming big enough to have its own analyst, so I started. And frankly, I loved it ever since. I haven't changed anything. I had to cover the sugar industry for a little while next to aquaculture and fisheries, but I eventually just decided to do, or let's say the team said you need one person full time, and here I am.
Very good. And am I right in thinking you specialise mainly in salmon, shrimp?
Yeah, so it has changed over time. The primary role of our work is to support all the bank's activities in the sector. And it's usually about our lending activities, but also M&A and more recently private equity and venture capital activities. And traditionally, salmon has been our biggest species.
Okay.
We really look at that one from the beginning to the end of the value chain, from the wellboats and genetics and feed all the way up. But over time, we've had other sectors. In the wildcat sector, tuna used to be quite big for us. The groundfish are important. Pelagics and fishmeal have always been very important due to the bank's strong activities in Peru and Chile and in the North Atlantic basin. And more recently, I would say shrimp is becoming more and more important. Okay. As the Western companies have, particularly feed and technology, have grown into that sector, I would say shrimp is becoming more and more important. And you also see shrimp becoming important at the consumption end. The processing in Europe and North America, shrimp is, let's say, one of the two winning species.
Okay. And what would you say are the big trends that are happening at the moment in salmon and shrimp? Right. You know, how are things shaping up for this year so far?
So it's been an eventful year, particularly in salmon. If we start with the salmon industry, we actually, I think, and many others, expected really an excellent year. Mm-hmm. A year where the biological problems would be behind us and we would have good volume, and we knew that demand is still relatively good, so profitability was supposed to be spectacular.
Okay. This is after a couple of quite tough years, or?
Exactly. So as you know, we've had a really challenging 2.5 years. We had El Nino in Peru, in Chile. We had the lice issues and the winter bacterium really impacting Norway. But all of those things have mitigated, have stopped to a large extent even, mostly due to better temperatures. Mm-hmm. In Norway, you see the water temperature is much warmer during the winter. And in Chile, you also notice that the cooler temperature now has more stable oxygen levels. So that was let's say the thesis that we had. Unfortunately, and then you can never predict this, it turned out that it was the supply was too good. Okay. The recovery of the volume was more than expected. There are some weeks that Norway produced 35-40% more salmon.
Wow.
And you can imagine for a fresh product, the price has to adjust considerably for that to clear. There's really not much the sector can do about it. So we saw a dramatic drop in prices, starting from somewhere around 110, 120 NOK. That was quite common last year. Mm-hmm. At this time of year. We now saw 65, 70 NOK.
Okay.
Now, luckily, the production costs had come down, but it had come down to maybe between 50 and 60 NOK. So still a large part of the industry is not profitable,
Right.
particularly when those weeks came when you really had to sell for very discounted price. So unfortunately, the really great profitability that we thought would come did not materialize. There is a silver lining. The silver lining is the biology is good, the vaccines work, the industry can produce more salmon, and consumption has increased. And we'll have to wait for a few more quarters before prices improve.
Okay, and presumably there's a silver lining for consumers, for me and you.
Absolutely, yeah. For consumers, for salmon lovers, absolutely. There's great volume growth. On the net, Norway produced 25% more salmon in quarter two, which is a huge increase.
Okay.
I think the year will probably end up being at 7 to 8, maybe even 9% growth, which is a record year. So there'll be more salmon. And it comes also at a time when many of the other proteins are struggling with production and with tariffs and with high prices. So salmon is really carving a bigger stomach share for itself now.
Other proteins being terrestrial or in the seafood space?
No, more like the beef, the pork, and the chicken. Really the big proteins are all having their own issues. So you see now salmon coming in with a big advantage, an advantage of, say it already was a very desirable protein, but now with the promotional activities from the industry. Now, the other sector is, of course, shrimp, right? And there, I would say the situation is really quite different. But first of all, shrimp is a different industry in that it's very much demand or market-driven industry. Unlike salmon, the supply side is very elastic. It's a short cycle with a lot of overcapacity. So it's quite easy for the industry to very quickly ramp up production. So we focus our analysis primarily on the markets. And actually we were starting the year also in a good spot.
Because shrimp's had it very tough for a number of years now.
Oh, exactly. And there the things were opposite. We've had 2 or 3 years of 2 years of oversupply. Too much production, particularly Ecuador was the one that brought a lot of new supply to the market, so prices were very low. But then throughout 2024, Ecuadorian supply was becoming every month lower. So they started with a plus 20% growth in the beginning of the year. By the end of the year was negative 2%.
Okay.
So at the end, the whole year ended up being flat. So there was no growth for the whole year. And that reduction in supply eventually increased the prices to a point where it was quite good for the whole industry. And now we are seeing, let's say, what is the potential for another oversupply situation. And that comes from 3 different factors. One is that, again, supply is starting to grow. So Ecuador had a few months of 20% growth, and on average they're at 15.2 for Q1, which is much higher than global consumption. Of course, they are now by far the biggest producer, so when they produce at this level, it will very quickly saturate the market. Secondly, we are now in an environment of much higher tariffs. So we not only have the 10% tariff that the US introduced, the Donald Trump, let's say, post-Liberation Day tariff, but they also have anti-dumping and countervailing duties. These range somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on which the company is. So some of the Asian producers, which have, somewhere about 60-70% of the market in the US, they're facing potentially 15-20% tariff now.
This is countries like Indonesia, for example.
Indonesia, Vietnam, India. In total, Asia is, I would say, 60% of the market in the US.
Right.
And they have a pretty high tariff as it is now. So add that to the increasing volume and plus the weakening of the demand. This tariff wars have always also taken a toll on European, American demand, and as we know, China is extremely important in the shrimp world. While in salmon, China is not that important, although it has been a really strong buyer of salmon. In shrimp, China is the largest importer, and for maybe a decade they've been driving imports, and now their imports are negative or flat due to the very serious sentiment change of the consumers in China.
So there's major kind of structural issues in China, aren't there?
Really structural issues, things that we haven't seen ever historically. Like, let me elaborate. So in China, after the, let's say, exit of COVID, the world and also the Chinese importers expected that the Chinese consumer would rush to buy product, just like we had in the West, that restaurants would be open and suddenly they would be filled with people. And that simply didn't materialize. And the reason for that is that there's a completely other dynamic, an internal dynamic, which has to do with the real estate market in China. Most consumers, or many people in China, have their savings in real estate, either in their own houses or second house that they own. And these, basically these represent their savings, their pension, and their safety net. And the value of this has collapsed by 30 to 50%. So that
was a very rapid collapse, wasn't it?
Yeah, it happened over maybe 1 or 2 year period. And now what the people have done is greatly increase their saving rate. So they are concerned that they don't have enough funds for the future. They have generally negative sentiment. So what they do is they save more. And when you save more, you don't spend. So the government has to turn this cycle around. But it's very difficult, very difficult. What they really need to do at the end is to deregulate wages, to deregulate the yuan, let the yuan flow freely, and most likely it will appreciate. If you deregulate wages, wages will appreciate in China, and that would then create the positive cycle. But although the government has said that they really want to support consumption, and that consumption needs to be the new driver of the Chinese economy, and it needs to be, they haven't done everything that's necessary so far.
Okay, so you've got 2 of the 3 biggest markets for shrimp. China don't want to spend money on it, and the Americans are being priced out because of the tariff increase. Is that the issue?
That's a good summary of it. So now we are basically relying on Europe to drive shrimp consumption, and Europe has always been, from the 3 big market drivers, the one that is most saturated, most mature, where you see the least amount of growth potential. And yet it's been the best market so far. So that's why I see these 3 elements, the tariffs, the weakness of the markets, and the growing volume, as major, I would say, red flags, that as we go towards the second half of the year, we might find ourselves in a situation with high inventories, weaker demand, and if more supply comes, prices will start to collapse, and then we'll go back to where we were in the beginning of 2024.
Okay, so do you see more consolidation, more issues for farmers themselves?
Yeah, it seems that farmers are always caught in the middle. They're the ones that absorb that volatility of the price. And yes, we've seen consolidation in Ecuador. We've seen consolidation in Asia. Although in Asia it's a little bit more complicated. And typically, when prices fall, what you see is farmers moving in and moving out of the sector. Okay. So now prices are high. You see people in their villages, they are moving into the industry. They're opening up farms which perhaps were not doing anything or were doing something else. They throw shrimp in the water, they start farming, and they hope for the best. But if they lose money once or twice, they will move out. So there the supply curve is different, is not so permanent because of the issues with land ownership rights.
Okay.
So it's much more difficult for the villagers to buy their own land. They usually lease it from the local government.
Okay. And you mentioned tariffs in the shrimp sector. What about tariffs in the salmon sector? Because they've been having, well, there's a lot of concern, particularly in Canada, when there were plans for, is it a 20 or 25% tariff?
Yeah. So initially there was a big scare for Canada. I remember when Trump announced the 25% on Mexico and on Canada. That would have been a disaster for Canada, with 87% of their product going to the US and very limited capability to, in the short term, move out of the US. They would have absorbed the full brunt. Basically, the prices would have collapsed and they would have made losses until they stopped producing. So luckily, that didn't happen, and actually the opposite happened. Trump gave everyone else 10%, and they got 0.
Okay.
So now they're actually looking pretty good. Now, if this had been shrimp, they would have been able to quickly ramp up volume and, let's say, benefit from their advantage. Unfortunately, this is salmon, and salmon is like a great big oil tanker. It's a 2-year production cycle, but even more than that, you need licensing, you need development, you need capex. So there's almost no chance that Canada will actually increase in any material way in the near future to benefit from this, which then in turn is good for the Chileans especially, because Chile is the one country that is, after Canada, most reliant on the United States. It's somewhere between 40-50% of their sales are there, and they have a 10% tariff. So it doesn't mean that that Canada will take any market share from Chile at all. In fact, we don't know how this will play out, but what's going on in British Columbia is very concerning. There's a deadline, 2029, where the farms are supposed to produce in a different way, so not producing in cages in the marine environment. By now we know that it's very unlikely that they can change in the near term or in that time frame. So it could mean that the salmon industry, after 30 years of operating in British Columbia, would exit. So nowadays British Columbia is about 1/3 of Canadian production. So it could actually still decline even further despite their advantage.
Okay. So for the remaining Canadian producers, it's going to be good news, I suppose. But
I guess so.
No.
The east coast of Canada is a more difficult place to farm salmon. It has a higher temperature range volatility, and also historically it has been a high cost area. But indeed, with enough investment, they could benefit from it.
And you mentioned changes to the legislation, or potential changes to the legislation in Canada, in BC, but also there's kind of noises in Norway that there might be some change. So how's that going to, what's happening there?
I think actually the white paper that was produced earlier this year by the Norwegian government was one of the most important legislations that we've seen in a while.
But it's not legislation.
No,
yet.
absolutely not. It's just a white paper. You can see it as a kind of a guidance to where the industry should be going in the long term. And it's very clear that, in a nutshell, the government is suggesting that the externalities from the salmon farms need to be internalized more.
So you're talking about waste, you're talking about lice, talking about...
Yeah, the primary things that they were focusing on was lice and mortality, and mortality of the farm species, but also mortality of the wild salmon swimming nearby. So these are some of the aspects that they wanted to change. But the document had many really radical viewpoints, such as eliminating the maximum allowable biomass system and replacing it with some kind of a lice emission scheme where you could sell and buy lice emissions. Now, None of this will become law anytime soon, and it will be a process of iterative process of discussion between the industry and the government. But what we all already know, that there will be new legislation coming soon which will be in that direction. So adding more cost for externalities.
Okay.
And I think the most important balance that they need to strike here is that the legislation needs to be passed, but for the legislation to be successful, the industry has to be profitable, because the industry will need to make very large capex investments into technologies that make that possible. Now, if you would move too quickly, you will add cost, and the cost reduces the cash flow the companies have. It makes it a lot more difficult for them to make the necessary investments. So the balance will need to be right, that you create the right incentives, some positive, some negative, to move the industry towards that goal in a careful, planned way.
And you mentioned technologies, investing in technologies. What sort of areas are you thinking of there?
It will be roughly more of what we've already seen. So the biggest technology so far has been the post-smolt technology. So a lot of farmers investing in large RAS hatcheries. There are multiple benefits from this. You have a more robust juvenile. You have fewer months at sea. You need less pesticide or medicative treatments because of these two factors, and you utilize your license faster. So these were already motivations there, but when you add the other costs, such as the lice emission costs or mortality, whatever they will come up with, that will make that even further, even a better investment.
So they'll be spending more time on land, most
Yeah,
likely.
more time on land, but it will combine with other technologies. Another technology that looks to really benefit from this is, for instance, the closed containment or the semi-closed containment. Again, that one really benefits versus lice and emissions of lice. So you can expect that one to become much more prevalent. And finally, although probably most distant into the future, will be the offshore technology. And again, that really works well. Offshore has the potential to have very limited environmental impact. And you could even think of a model where a large post-smolt is directly going into the offshore environment without spending any time in the coastal place where most of the lice and environmental pressure is. But we need many new legislations to make that happen.
Okay, so exciting times, but farmers are going to have to adapt pretty quick.
They'll have to adapt. Maybe if we're lucky, there will also be legislation which will lower the tax rate. That's still unknown how it will look like, but that will allow for more cash flow to be invested into these new technologies.
Because the farmers are paying much, as of a year ago, paying much higher tax, aren't they?
Exactly. The farming stage is being taxed at a higher rate. So hopefully that will be modified. And as I said, most likely this low price environment will not last more than one quarter or maybe two. So then we'll go back to a good profitability. So then the industry should have the enough firepower to make the really necessary investments. But I'm convinced that within 5 years from now, or maybe 5 to 10 years, the salmon industry will be unrecognizable. It will be a completely different industry than it is now, and it will be even more sustainable than it is now.
And unrecognizable in terms of the production systems?
Yes, in terms of the way things look like, the way the cages, the scale of the, let's say, the RAS or the offshore production. And who knows, with these things, sometimes there are unforeseen technologies we haven't really looked at. Maybe submersible technologies would emerge, or there's so many things happening. within a time frame of 5 to 10 years, you always underestimate the change.
Exciting times. And we haven't touched on fish meal and fish oil, the fuel for all these farms.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, the fish meal and fish oil sector, as you know, was highly impacted by the El Nino about 1.5 years ago. But since then, we've had, basically we are now in the third half-year season from Peru, which has been, I would say, excellent. So high quota, high catch rate, and relatively good prices. Particularly the last quota was, I would say, well above anybody's expectations. I think most people were expecting 2.5 million tons. We got 3, which is really good. It looks like that the catch rate will be fairly high. So my guess is that it probably need to go back to 2018 to see a season with higher productivity than, let's say, production of fish meal and fish oil than now. So that's one aspect of it. But another one that I find as an interesting observation is that I was really surprised how come the prices of particularly fish meal did not correct as much as I would have expected. And we have a model where we look at a few different drivers of prices. Now, one of them, one important one, is the soybean meal price. Soybean meal has had also a number of phenomenal years. Production is strong, and also this year is going to be a record production. And the sector is even being driven more by the demand for soy oil, which means now actually soy meal is kind of the byproduct, and that price has come quite low, even below what we call the $300 range. Soybean meal is a partial substitute with fish meal, so at least historically there has been a kind of a mean reverting relationship between these two. We would have expected in a year where soy meal is plentiful, but also fish meal is plentiful, that fish meal would become close to the average of the historical period. But that didn't happen at all. In fact, the relationship between soy meal and fish meal has never been this, the ratio has never been this high. Right. We are now, at least the 2 data points I'm using, at 6 times. So the fish meal is 6 times more expensive than fish oil, soybean meal, and it should be around 4.3.
Okay.
Now my theory for this change is that it seems to me that the demand function for fish meal has changed. In the past, the Chinese pork industry was still quite an important buyer of fish meal, and they tend to be pretty price elastic. But in the last few years, due to consolidation in China, only very large producers have taken over the market, and they are quite sophisticated. They have basically abandoned fish meal. So the buyers of fish meal are now largely the aquaculture industry. So it's consumption, so to say, the growth of salmon versus the growth of shrimp. And as you heard in the previous conversation, both of these sectors are growing quite rapidly in volume. So they need more fish meal, and they are not as flexible as the pork producers. So I think we have a new normal, and for fish meal this could be the trough, and the trough is actually in price, and the trough seems to be quite high. Wow. So certainly for those producers of fish meal, this is quite a good data point to visualize. Right. That in a year where prices should have been low, they have a lot of volume, but prices are actually quite good.
So sort of overall, it seems like there's a lot of volatility at the moment. Salmon, shrimp, fish meal, fish oil is keeping you guessing. As an analyst, it can't make your job too easy. But kind of looking ahead at the next 6 months, I suppose, what do you think, kind of looking at the bigger picture, the bigger aquaculture picture, how do you see things changing and progressing?
Yeah, very difficult to say. I mean, it's always difficult to make these predictions, but this year is probably the hardest one, particularly the geopolitical volatility, the fact that seafood is so traded, and yet it seems that the tools of this geopolitical conflict are often tariffs. We would have to take a view on the tariffs, and that seems, I mean, guessing what Donald Trump is going to do is not an easy thing. He seems to be quite unpredictable in his policies. I would say, let's say we look beyond Donald Trump and we go a little bit further out into the future. I'm a firm believer that both of these species, the salmon and shrimp, are the winners not only in the seafood category, but as proteins. I think they can grow at a rate considerably higher than global protein consumption. Let's say global protein consumption would be growing at 1 to 2%. Aquaculture may be a little bit higher than that, but both of these species would easily average, let's say, 4 to 5%. So double the growth, so increasing their stomach share, increasing their the size of their businesses. And that has to do with the fact that they are basically benefiting from many long-term trends. They're seen as a healthy protein, they're seen as a premium protein, and as people age and are more educated, they focus more on these proteins. They move away from pork, they move away from perhaps some wild catch products, and they go into these two categories. So I'm quite optimistic about it.
Good, excellent. Good to end on an optimistic note. Very good to see you, Gorjan.
Pleasure.